In today's video, I'm going to look at the L3, focusing on primary, and look at the big picture, the sort of the guidelines, and how we would structure L3 in a primary school. So let's get started. So learners should be doing the L3 from P5, and it can be P5 or earlier if they want to start it earlier, but it needs to be P5, P6 and P7. So it needs to be an experience in each of these 3 years. Now it mentions in the policy documents that it should be a quality learning experience with appropriate progression. So it needs to be well thought through rather than just something that's done fairly ad hoc. There's no requirement for that L3 to continue from primary into secondary. It might, but it doesn't need to. So the L3 is very much chosen by individual schools, dependent on their staffing, their expertise, and how they want to develop it. It might be that an ASG decides together, and it works in conjunction with the secondary languages department, but that is not a requirement. Now, there is quite a lot of information available that goes into nitty-gritty, and there's a link here for you to look at that. But what I have done is summarized it for you in this PowerPoint. So, in terms of what constitutes the L3, there is a wide plethora of languages that could be done. So in a lot of areas, we've got French, Gaelic, Spanish, German, BSL is really popular, Scots, and Mandarin, Italian. So a wide variety of languages. Makaton does not constitute, unfortunately, as an L3 because it's not considered to be a language. And you can get further information about that online. Or from a 1+2 development officer if you require it, or SILT. But general principles, the language needs to build on the skills and strategies that children have already learned in their L1 and in their L2, and that they can develop in the L3. The idea is not just to give them vocabulary lists, but it's to develop their language learning ability. And therefore it needs to be across all 4 skills: listening, talking, reading, and writing, as well as developing an awareness of grammar, language structures. And they'll already have that from their L1 and their L2. So this is a chance to build on it or look at a different language and how it operates. The idea is to further develop children's confidence in languages and also extend their global knowledge of different countries and different cultures around the world. And also get them to see connections. The more languages that they know, the more they'll maybe start to pick up links between certain types of languages, Romance languages or more sort of Germanic languages, for instance, and just see where the English comes into that, or other languages if pupils are not got English as a mother tongue. So in terms of how much language needs to be delivered, there's no prescriptive content of learners needing to cover certain topics or cover certain grammar points. The documentation really just suggests that it should be something that's planned by the school and teachers. It should be progressive, so it should develop. Okay, now that doesn't need to be between P5 developing the same language over the 3 years, but within the scope of whatever language is learning, it needs to be progressive. So it needs to go beyond just single words. Learners need to be able to put phrases and short sentences together. As I've already said, they need to develop their learning skills so they can actually use those skills, for instance, decoding. How do learners read? How do we listen? How do we listen out for keywords? Are we looking for detail? So it's that kind of being a detective and figuring out how language works. Already mentioned developing all 4 skills and appropriate language. So in terms of what's covered, it should be topics that are relevant to the learners, that interest them, and that engage them. So in primary school, the guidelines suggest that the children should be able to develop simple sentences in a spoken format, probably primarily talking about themselves, but it could be another theme or topic that interests them or that they've studied. So they should be able to understand, so there's your listening, a simple spoken text, and, again, on a familiar topic, something that they've covered, like their likes and dislikes. They should be able to hold a conversation, so they should be able to answer questions. So there's the listening and talking together, or working in a little role play situation with more maybe transactional language, for instance, like a shopping role play. And they should be able to decode a simple text, so using those language skills to be detectives. And lastly, you should be able to write a few sentences or phrases, but inevitably that will be with support, whether that's with a word bank, a list of words, a dictionary, a sort of a template, gap fill. It's not expecting them to manipulate language and just completely write creatively off the cuff. One of the key pitfalls to avoid is trying to do sort of just a cultural project, learning about France or Spain with very little language or just some keywords. The idea is to go beyond that. It's not just cultural information. It might all come together through an IDL, but that is slightly different. Okay, so how would it be delivered? So it could be that the language is scheduled, every Thursday morning we have our L3 Gaelic, for instance, and we have a regular slot of a certain amount of time. And that might be done every year, P5, P6 and P7, the same language, or it might be a different language each year. It could be done as a block. So over, for instance, a term, it would need to be, a concentrated period of time to enable children to progress and develop. So probably, a good term, 2 to 3 months would be ideal. And they would do a block of language. So that might be in their, one term in 1 year. P5, it might be Scots. In P6, they might still do Scots, but it might be another block at another time of year. And then again in P7. Or it could be a block of language, but it could be a different language each year. So it could be Scots, P5, P6 Gaelic, and P7 French, for instance. Or it could be part of an IDL. And again, as a period of a concentrated period of work over a good length of time, such as a term. And that IDL might be a topic like the rainforest and looking at countries in South America, for instance, and learning some Spanish to go along with that. So every model has different benefits, and there are positives and negatives with each model, and there's no one right answer or one model that fits. It's really what depends on your individual school, your context, your staffing, whether you want to take a cross-curricular IDL approach, and how it works best for you. It might also depend on what your secondary school does and whether you do want there to be progression, and whether you want learners to do the same language as they're doing in their secondary school and have an experience of that in their primary school. Who can teach it? It could be anybody that has a relevant experience and expertise. So it might be the class teacher. It might be somebody who has done a certain amount of language training, PLL, to get them up to that appropriate level. It could be another teacher in the school, such as the CCR cover teacher. It could be a secondary teacher. It could be somebody who's a native or fluent speaker, somebody in the community or a parent who might be coming in to work alongside the teacher. It's important to note that it doesn't need to be an expert. It could be that the teacher is learning with the children and all of them are learning together. And that is a good model also of showing how we learn by learning with the children. So I think that's quite important to note. I would say the only important thing to remember is that although there's no need for the L2 to progress, or the L3 rather, to progress from primary to secondary, in some cases, that the L3 could become the L2 in secondary if learners are given that option. So a secondary school might have a choice of 2 different languages for L2, say French and Spanish, And in the primary school, if the children have done French as their L2 and then Spanish as L3, if they have got up to sort of experienced and had the possibility to achieve at second level in Spanish, then they can switch that L3 and that can become their L2 in the secondary school. But for that to have happened, the teacher teaching the Spanish obviously has to teach it to quite a high level, up to second level, and needs to have the necessary experience, knowledge, and understanding of the language to be able to do that, and will have had to have suitable training probably to make that possible. So it's just important to bear that in mind. There are a couple of case studies here that you can have a look at of schools doing different L3 models. They're all hyperlinked. And here are some key questions for you to think about when you're planning and delivering and developing L3 in your school. So I'll leave you with those questions. You can download the PowerPoint and have a think about those questions. And then if you've got any questions, you might like to note those and share them with colleagues or, with your head teacher. And if you need any further support, then you can go to the SILT website for looking at 1+